Okay, so picture this. It's ninth century France. You're in this, like, dimly lit church. You've got incense chanting the whole 9 yards, and you're about to receive communion. But here's the thing, the people around you, I mean, they're not messing around. This isn't just a symbol for them. It's the actual body and blood of Christ.
It's a pretty intense image, right? And it gets right to the heart of what we're diving into, this whole mystery of the Eucharist, specifically how a ninth century monk named Ratramnus saw it.
Ratramnus. Okay, so for those of us who haven't exactly spent hours with our noses in theological texts, why should this name, like, ring a bell?
Well, imagine you're this monk, right? And you're wrestling with this huge IE idea. How can bread and wine actually become the body and blood of Christ? I mean, that's what Ratramnus was trying to wrap his head around, and his writing about it really stirred things up.
It sounds like he was kind of a big deal back then. So, who was this guy? Do we know much about him?
Well, we don't have a tell-all memoir or anything. Sadly, that's kind of typical for monks back then. He lived a pretty quiet life at the Abbey of Corbie. But his writings, that's where he really shines. He was known for being super sharp, like he'd already gotten into some hot water over his thoughts on predestination.
And then he really took the theological plunge with his take on the Eucharist, right? What exactly made his view so groundbreaking?
Ratramnus basically landed right in the middle of this huge debate that was raging in the church. They were trying to, really nail down the doctrine of the Eucharist. But there was all this disagreement about what really happened to the bread and wine. Like, some people saw it more symbolically, and then there were others who took it super literally, like the physical change and all that.
So Ratramnus is walking this theological tightrope here, trying to find this middle ground between, like, a purely symbolic ritual and, well, I guess something that could feel kind of cannibalistic.
Exactly. And trying to bridge that divide is what made his book on the body and blood of the Lord so controversial.
Okay, let's get into it. So Ratramnus says that the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. But what did he really mean by that?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Eh.
He uses this phrase substantially changed, and that's really at the core of what he was arguing.
Substantially changed. So not just in, like, our minds, but like a real actual shift.
Right. And to explain this, he makes this really interesting comparison to the creation of the universe.
Whoa, wait. He's comparing communion to the act of creation. That's a bold move.
It is. He's saying that just like God created the universe out of nothing, the Eucharist involves this similar kind of divine intervention. He says it's through the, and I quote, mystery of the priest and the act of thanksgiving that the bread and wine undergo this huge transformation.
Okay, so less like a magic trick, more like a holy act. But if it's actually transformed, why do we still just see bread and wine?
Oh, he totally addresses that. He says the appearance of bread and wine remain for the reverence of those receiving it. Basically, he's saying if we actually looked at it and saw flesh and blood, it would be, well, pretty freaky.
Yeah, I don't think anyone really wants to see that during a church service.
Exactly. But here's where Ratramnus gets really interesting. He says that while our senses are picking up just bread and wine, our faith, that's what lets us understand what we're really receiving. He's not saying it's just D about faith, but that you need both your mind and D your faith to get it.
So he's saying it's not enough to just show up and, go through the motions. You got to believe it too.
Exactly. He even writes that believers are rewarded because they fully believe in what is beyond the senses.
This is where I always get tripped up with this whole transubstantiation thing. It's one of those words, gets thrown around a lot, but always seems kind of fuzzy to me.
Transubstantiation. Yeah, it's a tough one. It's this whole idea that the bread and wine, they might look and taste the same, but they've actually totally changed, like in their essence, their substance.
Yeah.
They become the actual body and blood of Christ.
And this is where Ratramnus really starts ruffling some feathers, right? Because he's trying to find that balance, like literal versus symbolic.
He's walking a tightrope, for sure. He believes in a real transformation. But then he uses this word sign a lot when he talks about the Eucharist, which honestly threw a lot of people off.
Sign? Like a stop sign? What does that have to do with communion?
Yeah, he's not talking about street signs or anything like that. For Ratramnus, the bread and wine, even though they're transformed, they're like pointing to something way deeper, something beyond what we can actually see and touch.
Okay, so more like a symbol then.
Exactly. He's saying that taking part in communion, it's not just about the physical act of eating and drinking, right? It's about this whole spiritual communion with Christ that those elements represent.
So it's not just about like the mechanics of it, but the deeper meaning behind it all, which kind of brings us back to why he was so concerned about people taking it all so literally.
Absolutely. He even says that if we were literally eating Christ's body and blood, well, it would cease to exist.
Because we'd, what, eat him out of existence?
Yeah, essentially. He's saying Christ's presence in the Eucharist is something way bigger and more mysterious than just a physical thing. It's beyond our normal understanding. And he uses this great analogy to explain it, comparing it to a grain of wheat.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me with this grain of wheat analogy.
All right, so imagine a single grain of wheat. You plant it in the ground, it dies, but then it sprouts new life, right? Creating tons of new grains. Ratramnus is saying that each of those new grains contains the essence of that original grain, even if it's not the exact same physical grain.
Ah, okay, I see where you're going with this. So he's saying that even though the bread and wine are transformed, they still have that full essence of Christ within them, even if it's, a tiny little piece.
Exactly. It's about receiving the whole of Christ.
Uh-huh.
Body, blood, soul, divinity, all of it, in that moment of communion, no matter how small the bread or the sip of wine is.
This makes me think about how different people back then must have understood, like symbols and rituals.
That's so important to keep in mind, that historical context. Their world was full of symbolism, religious icons, rituals, even just nature. Everything was reflecting this deeper spiritual reality.
So when they saw bread and wine as a sign, it wasn't seen as some lesser form of belief. It was actually this powerful way of connecting with something truly profound.
Right. Ratramnus isn't trying to water down the Eucharist or anything. He's actually trying to elevate people's understanding of it by saying, hey, focus on your faith, your intellect, your ability to really receive this spiritual reality.
And he doesn't just leave it there. He goes on to talk about this idea of like receiving the Eucharist unworthily, which is where things get really, really intense.
Yeah. He doesn't shy away from the seriousness of it all, that's for sure.
Yeah.
For Ratramnus, it's not enough to just, get the concept intellectually. It demands real self-reflection, a true examination of your conscience.
He's saying we need to really be prepared, not just logistically, but like spiritually, morally, come to the table, so to speak, with our spiritual houses in order.
Exactly. He says that if we approach the Eucharist with unresolved sin in our lives, with a lack of genuine faith, we risk divine judgment. And he's not trying to freak people out. He's emphasizing just how important all of this is.
Okay, that Isaac, pretty intense. But he doesn't exactly leave us hanging there, does he? He talks about the importance of righting our wrongs and being worthy. So there's a way to approach the Eucharist, with the reverence it deserves. He gives us some kind of a roadmap, right?
He does. He connects judgment to this idea of self-reflection and personal growth.
Right.
He writes, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, if we judged ourselves, if we really thought about our lives and saw if we were worthy or not, and if we fixed our mistakes, we wouldn't be judged.
So it's about looking inward, being honest about our shortcomings, and actually like making things right. That's how we prepare ourselves.
Exactly. It's about examining our conscience, admitting where we've messed up and really trying to make things right with God and other people. And it's not about being perfect. It's about trying our best to live in line with what God wants for us.
And that inner transformation, going through that process of self-examination, it's not just about avoiding punishment. It's about becoming more open to the grace of the Eucharist.
That's it. He's saying the more we try to live how God wants us to, the more fully we can actually participate in this powerful, transformative sacrament. It's about what's happening inside of us, not just up there on the altar.
This has been, wow, really thought-provoking stuff. But let's be real for a sec. We've gone pretty deep on 9th century theology here. Why should someone today, like in our modern world, even care what some monk had to say about bread and wine?
Because the stuff Ratramnus was wrestling with. It's still relevant. I mean, how do we make sense of rituals and symbols in a world that's so obsessed with, what we can see and touch? How do we cultivate a faith that goes beyond just the surface?
And how do we balance intellectual understanding with the more, mysterious experiential parts of faith? It's not always easy to do.
Exactly. Ratramnus reminds us that true faith involves our minds, our hearts. And that sometimes the most profound truths, they're revealed through these signs and symbols. They point us towards something bigger than ourselves, something we might not be able to grasp right away.
It's like he's saying, don't just see the bread and wine, don't just understand the theology, really experience it all.
Perfectly said.
Yeah.
He's encouraging us to approach this ancient ritual,
Hmm.
or really any ritual for that matter, with a sense of wonder, with the willingness to say, okay, I don't have to understand everything completely, to just be open to the possibility of being transformed by it.
So the next time you encounter some kind of ritual, whether it's religious or not, ask yourself, what's the deeper meaning here? What kind of change is this act inviting me to embrace? Really something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.